A homeless man stopped me the moment I stepped off my porch, his hand lifted in a hesitant warning. "Ma'am, don't start that car. Someone messed with it." His voice shook like he knew more than he should. I froze, my keys cold in my palm, the morning quiet settling around us. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. Something in his eyes told me the danger wasn't a misunderstanding, and the person behind it wasn't a stranger. I thanked him softly, slipped my keys into my purse, and walked back inside to call a cab to the inheritance meeting. The ride over felt heavier than the gray November sky pressing against the windows. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from. Sometimes knowing where a story travels reminds us we're not alone." The downtown law office sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, its windows polished to a shine that reflected the pale morning light. As I stepped into the lobby, the marble floor gleamed under my shoes, far too bright for a day that already felt wrong. I had imagined this meeting would be solemn, respectful, a final gesture of closure after losing my husband of 42 years. Instead, an unease curled beneath my ribs, steady and cold. My daughter-in-law, Marissa, stood near the reception desk. She wasn't supposed to see me arrive, not yet. But when her eyes landed on me, safe, unharmed, breathing, her smile flickered for half a second. Just half. Enough to tell me the homeless man hadn't been mistaken. Enough to tell me she had expected a very different outcome to my drive that morning. I didn't confront her. I didn't even slow my steps. I simply nodded in greeting and made my way toward the conference room, my hands steady, my pulse calm. Let her think I didn't know. Let her believe I was still the quiet woman who never questioned, never pushed back. For now. The conference room felt colder than the lobby, the kind of cold that settled into the corners of a place meant to look prestigious. I took a seat at the long oak table, smoothing the sleeves of my coat while the quiet pressed in around me. The chair my husband used to choose during meetings stood empty across from me, and for a moment, the memory of him, steady, warm, certain, rose like a soft ache behind my ribs. I kept my hands folded, my back straight. Grief was still there, but it no longer swallowed whole. It simply lived beside me. Marissa slipped into the room a minute later, her heels tapping a little too loudly on the floor. She chose a seat farther down the table, pretending to scroll through her phone, pretending not to glance at me every few seconds. Her tension moved like a small current through the room, brushing against the edges of my awareness, but not quite reaching me. I let her fidget. I let her wonder how I'd arrived here without incident. Outside the glass wall, the city moved as if nothing strange had happened that morning. People with coffee cups, buses exhaling clouds of steam, a delivery truck backing into the alley across the street. Life continued, steady and unaware. I watched it for a moment, letting its rhythm steady my own. The door opened again, and my son stepped in. His eyes flicked from me to Marissa, confusion tightening his brow. He must have expected me to be late, or not to show at all. "Mom," he said quietly, but the greeting carried something brittle beneath it, something he didn't try to hide well. I nodded, offering him the same calm I'd carried since sunrise. "Good morning." He took the seat beside Marissa. She leaned in, whispering something behind her hand, and he looked at me again. Quick, uncertain, puzzled. Whatever she had promised him, whatever future she had painted, it was beginning to crack at the edges. The attorney arrived last, placing a stack of folders on the table before settling into his chair. "Thank you all for being here," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Today we'll review the final provisions of your husband's estate." My husband's name hung in the air, anchored by the weight of decades. I breathed in slowly, letting the sound of it settle over me. As the attorney organized the documents, Marissa tugged at her sleeve. My son tapped his foot. Their nerves filled the room with a quiet, restless energy, like a storm building somewhere just out of sight. I sat still. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, fading as quickly as it rose. Inside, the attorney opened the first folder. And just before he spoke, I caught Marissa watching me again, this time not with confusion, but with something sharper, tighter. She looked at me as though she was waiting for me to fall apart, or to reveal the fear she was certain I carried. But I only folded my hands a little tighter and kept my gaze steady on the papers before us. Let her keep guessing. The attorney cleared his throat, flipping through the first set of pages with deliberate care. Paper whispered against paper, a quiet sound that carried more weight than any raised voice could. My son leaned forward, eager, his knee bouncing under the table. Marissa kept her eyes locked on the folder, as if willing the outcome to match whatever she'd planned. I stayed still, letting the room move around me. These documents outline your husband's intended distribution of assets, the attorney said. He updated them shortly before his passing. A tiny shift crossed Marissa's face. Surprise, then something like panic swallowing it whole. She hadn't expected that. She had counted on old paperwork, loopholes she could twist, influence she believed she'd earned. Her fingers tightened around her pen until her knuckles turned pale. My son shot her a quick glance, a silent request for reassurance. She didn't give him any. The attorney continued, unaware of the tension stretching thin between us. He also added notes regarding property safety and concerns he wanted addressed in the event of any unusual activity involving family members. Another flicker in Marissa's expression. Quicker this time. Sharper. The morning warning replayed in my mind. The homeless man's trembling voice, the fear behind his urgency. A stranger had stepped in to protect me. A stranger had seen what my own family refused to see. I folded my hands in my lap, grounding myself in the moment, breathing in the faint scent of the attorney's polished wood desk. My son shifted again. Is this different from what we reviewed last year? He asked, his voice lower than before, stripped of its confidence. Yes, the attorney replied. Significantly. Silence settled across the table, thick as dust in an attic left untouched. Marissa finally looked at me, and I watched the truth break across her features, quiet but unmistakable. I had shown up safely. I had taken my seat. I was not the easy obstacle she thought she could move aside. The attorney laid out another document. This section designates control and oversight of all accounts to his spouse unless explicit conditions are met by secondary beneficiaries. My son blinked, confused. Marissa's breath caught in her throat, barely audible. I kept my gaze on the papers, not on her. I didn't need to see her panic to know it was there. It moved through the room like a current, brushing the back of my neck, quiet but undeniable. Outside the glass wall, winter light shifted, drawing a pale reflection across the tabletop. Inside, the attorney turned one final page. We'll review the conditions in detail shortly, he said. But before we proceed, I'll need to confirm that everyone arrived safely today. There were security concerns reported in the parking area. My son straightened. Marissa stilled. I lifted my chin just slightly, enough to acknowledge the question. Yes, I said, my voice even. I arrived safely. And for the first time that morning, Marissa couldn't hide the fear tightening her jaw. The attorney paused, letting the question about the parking lot settle into the air like dust that refused to fall. My son shifted in his chair, trying to mask the unease crawling up his spine. Marissa didn't move at all. She sat perfectly still, shoulders stiff, lips pressed into a thin line that trembled at the edges. The attorney adjusted his glasses. We received a report that someone was seen near one of the vehicles earlier this morning. Unusual behavior. We may need to review the footage. A single beat of silence passed, then another. Marissa's pen slipped from her hand and tapped lightly against the table. The sound was small, but in a room this quiet, it echoed like a warning bell. My son glanced at her, searching her face for an explanation. She didn't offer one. I sat with my hands folded neatly, feeling neither triumph nor fear, just a steady clarity, the kind that comes when scattered pieces begin to slide into the places they were always meant to be. The warning, the strange behavior, the sudden tension, each memory a puzzle piece clicking into place. The attorney continued, unaware of how close his words came to the truth. Your husband noted concerns about interference with his estate. He wanted every detail verified, every person accountable. Marissa exhaled sharply, the sound too quick, too forced. She tried to recover, but the strain showed in her shoulders, in the way her eyes darted toward the hallway, as if searching for an escape she couldn't take. My son finally leaned toward her. Is something wrong? She shook her head a bit too fast. No. Nothing. Her voice carried a thinness that clung to the air. The attorney pushed a new folder forward. Your husband wrote a letter to accompany today's reading. He requested it be shared before we finalized the documents. My breath steadied. I knew my husband. I knew how carefully he observed, how he protected quietly, thoughtfully. Whatever he had written, he meant it to speak when he no longer could. The attorney unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly. My son leaned closer. Marissa swallowed hard. He wrote, the attorney began, that trust is the foundation of every family, and that the smallest action can reveal who stands with you and who stands against you. The room shifted then, not physically, but in the way tension tightened like a pulled thread. Marissa lowered her gaze, avoiding the words, avoiding the truth that hovered inches above her. My son looked between us, confusion settling onto his features like a shadow he couldn't shake. I kept my focus on the letter, not on her. Not yet. The attorney read on, his calm voice filling the room. The words were simple, steady, exactly the way my husband used to speak when something mattered most, and while he read, I felt the day turning. Quietly, slowly, but unmistakably. The attorney's voice softened as he reached the final lines of the letter, though he read them exactly as written, steady, clear, without embellishment. My husband had never been a man of many words, but when he spoke, he meant every syllable. Hearing his thoughts laid out on paper brought a quiet tightening to my chest. Not grief exactly, but the weight of understanding. He had seen more than any of us realized. He had prepared for more than I knew. When the attorney folded the letter and set it aside, the room didn't move. No one reached for water. No one cleared their throat. Even the hum of the air vent seemed to fade. My son stared straight ahead, lips parted slightly, as if he wasn't sure how to swallow what he'd just heard. Marissa kept her gaze trained on the table, her fingers pressed so hard against her pen that the plastic bent under the pressure. The attorney opened the next folder. Your husband included a list of individuals he trusted to intervene if anything unusual happened after his passing. His eyes skimmed a line. Neighbors, business partners, and a few unexpected names. A faint shiver moved through Marissa, small but unmistakable. My mind drifted back to the homeless man, his anxious eyes, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone might follow him. I hadn't asked how he knew. I didn't have to. My husband had always treated people with dignity, no matter their circumstances. It didn't surprise me that someone he'd once helped would choose to help me in return. The attorney continued. He noted that if any harm, physical or financial, came toward his spouse, all secondary claims to the estate would be suspended pending investigation. My son blinked hard, as though trying to reset the moment. Suspended? He repeated, voice faint. Yes, the attorney said. Immediately. The words didn't strike like a thunderclap. They settled quietly, like snow falling on a roof, soft, cold, undeniable. I watched the realization seep into my son's thoughts, watched as the lines on his forehead deepened. His confusion wasn't malicious. It was the confusion of someone who had believed a version of events crafted for him, not by him. Marissa finally lifted her eyes. She didn't look at her husband. She didn't look at the attorney. She looked at me. A thin, trembling breath left her, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no pretense in her expression. No performance. Just fear edging into disbelief. The attorney set aside the documents. Before we move forward, he said, I'll need to confirm everyone's understanding of the safety concerns mentioned earlier. There's a report from this morning I'd like to review. Marissa straightened abruptly, a reflex more than a choice. My son glanced at her again, but this time the look held something new. Hesitation. Suspicion forming like frost along the edge of a window pane. I rested my hands on the polished oak table, feeling the quiet strength in my own stillness. The pieces were moving, not loudly, not quickly, but with certainty. And for the first time in a long while, the truth was no longer something I carried alone. The attorney reached for a remote on the table, its small black surface reflecting the overhead lights. Before we continue with asset allocation, he said, building security sent over a clip from the parking lot, time-stamped this morning. His tone stayed neutral, but something in it carried weight, the kind that makes a room inhale all at once. A screen lowered from the ceiling with a soft mechanical hum. Marissa stiffened, hands clasped together so tightly her rings pressed into her skin. My son leaned back slightly, confusion mixing with something sharper, an unease he could no longer ignore. The video began, Grainy footage. Early light. Rows of parked cars. Then my sedan came into view. A figure approached it, hood pulled up, movements quick but cautious. Not enough to identify, but enough to reveal intent. Enough to raise every question that had been swirling quietly beneath the morning. The attorney paused the clip. Security flagged this because they recognized your vehicle, he said, looking at me, then at my son. We usually report any tampering to the owner immediately. My son's jaw tightened. Tampering? He repeated, barely above a whisper. Marissa didn't speak. She didn't blink. She looked at the frozen image on the screen like it had betrayed her personally. The attorney continued. Maintenance inspected the car afterward. Something was placed near the undercarriage. Not damaging, but irregular. Potentially meant to startle or delay. He tapped the folder gently. Not an accident. A quiet shifted across the table then, heavy, certain, impossible to dismiss. My son turned to his wife slowly, searching her face for reassurance, denial, anything. She offered none. I kept my gaze steady on the screen. I remembered the homeless man's voice, the tremor in it, the urgency. I remembered the way Marissa had gone still when she saw me walk into the building unharmed. The pieces aligned themselves without force. The attorney shut off the display. We will follow protocol, he said. Security will continue reviewing footage frame by frame. For now, I need to note that Mrs. Carter, he nodded toward me, arrived by taxi, not by her personal vehicle. My son swallowed hard. Mom, why didn't you drive? I didn't feel safe, I said simply. The truth didn't need decoration. It didn't need volume. It just needed space to exist, and it finally had that. Marissa clasped her hands tighter. Her breathing quickened, a thin, unsteady rhythm. She looked at her husband, but he no longer looked back with blind trust. Something had shifted, subtle but irreversible. The attorney reopened his folder. Given these circumstances, the next section of the estate documents becomes especially relevant. Silence again. But this time it wasn't tense. It was revealing. I folded my hands together, grounding myself in the moment, steady as the oak table beneath them. The day wasn't finished speaking. The attorney placed a new document on the table, sliding it forward with the same steady care he'd used for every page before it. But this one felt different the moment it appeared. Heavier somehow, as if the ink itself carried intent. My son leaned in, shoulders tight, eyes fixed on the bold header at the top. Marissa didn't lean at all. She stayed rigid, hands clasped in her lap, her gaze unfocused like she was bracing for a wave she could no longer outrun. This section, the attorney said, details the conditions your husband added to protect his spouse from any form of manipulation or duress. His tone remained professional, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it. A line being drawn. My son swallowed. Conditions? Yes, the attorney replied. Your father wanted to ensure fairness. He wrote that any attempt, direct or indirect, to intimidate, endanger, or pressure Mrs. Carter would void all secondary claims immediately. Marissa's composure cracked, just slightly. A small tremor moved through her shoulders. She tried to hide it, but the movement lived in the space between us now, undeniable. The attorney continued. He noted that trust can be measured through behavior, that actions speak long before words do. A memory rose. My husband standing at the back door years ago, wiping soil from his hands after planting a new row of hydrangeas. He'd smiled at me then, soft, knowing. He had always been a man who watched for the quiet truths others overlooked. My son pressed his palm against his thigh, grounding himself. So, if something happened to my mom, if she was harmed or put at risk, the attorney said, intentionally or negligently, yes, all inheritances tied to the secondary beneficiaries would be suspended pending review. The words settled over the room with an eerie stillness. Marissa finally spoke, her voice thin. That seems excessive. The attorney didn't flinch. Your father-in-law was thorough. My son turned toward her. Not abruptly, slowly, as if the morning had been a darkened room and the attorney had just pulled the curtains open. Did you know about these conditions? He asked. She shook her head too quickly, the denial fragile. Of course not. But the air between them shifted. A small, invisible doorway had opened, and doubt walked straight through. I stayed quiet, my hands resting on the cool oak surface, fingers gently intertwined. This wasn't a moment that needed force. It only needed presence. The attorney folded his hands. Given the concerns raised by this morning's incident, and the footage security is still reviewing, These conditions are now formally activated. My son's breath hitched. Marissa's lips parted, but no words came out. Outside, a car horn echoed faintly from the street, the world continuing as usual. Inside, everything in that conference room tilted. Softly, silently, but enough to change the shape of the day. I lifted my gaze to meet Marissa's across the table. She looked away first. The attorney lifted another document from the stack, thinner than the others but marked with a red tab. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he took a moment, one quiet breath, one measured glance across the table, as if preparing everyone for what came next. My son sat straighter. Marissa didn't move at all. Her stillness had shifted from tense to rigid, the kind that comes when a person realizes they no longer control the direction of a moment. "This," the attorney said, "is the verification log your husband requested, a record of who contacted this office, when, and for what purpose." My son frowned. "Contacted the office? About what?" The attorney slid the log forward. "Your father was very specific. He wanted transparency. He asked us to document any attempt to influence or alter the estate before or after his passing." A soft tapping began at the far end of the table. It took a moment for me to realize it was Marissa's foot. Even through the thick carpet, the rhythm carried an edge of fracture. My son looked at her, searching her face again, but her gaze stayed pinned on the document like it might combust if she blinked. The attorney opened the log. There are several entries, routine inquiries, clarifications, and one request, made 3 weeks ago, asking about the possibility of adjusting secondary allocations. My son's head snapped toward her. 3 weeks ago? Who called? The attorney didn't answer immediately. He simply turned the page, revealing a printed phone number beside the entry. Marissa's fingers curled inward, nails digging into her palm. My son leaned closer, eyes narrowing as he read the digits. Recognition dawned slowly, painfully. That's our home number. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence did all the work. It stretched across the table like a long shadow, settling between them, revealing more than any accusation could. Marissa finally spoke, voice thin as paper. "It was just a question. I didn't change anything." "You tried," my son said. Not loud, not angry, just stunned. The attorney remained steady. "The call did not result in any changes, but your father wanted all attempts noted." My gaze drifted to the window, the winter light washing the street in a pale glow. My husband had always understood people better than they believed. He had prepared for the quiet betrayals, the kind delivered in whispers, not shouts. The attorney closed the log. "There is additional documentation we will review, but before that, we need to address one more matter. Security found something near the vehicle that matches a description given by an eyewitness." Marissa's breath hitched. A small, sharp sound. My son turned fully toward her now. "What eyewitness?" Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. The attorney folded his hands. "A man in the parking lot reported seeing someone approach the car. He described the person's build, clothing, and behavior." My heartbeat stayed steady. I already knew what the next words would confirm. My instincts. The warning. Every quiet shift in the morning's air. The attorney continued, "Security is bringing him upstairs shortly to verify his statement." For the first time since the meeting began, Marissa's mask cracked completely. Her eyes widened, faint, frantic, and she looked toward the door as though calculating how far she could get if she stood up right then. My son saw it. I saw it. The truth was no longer assembling itself. It was arriving. The door opened with a soft click, the kind that usually goes unnoticed. Except this time, every head in the room turned. A security guard stepped inside first, holding the door for the man who followed. His coat was worn, his posture careful, but his eyes were steady. I recognized him instantly. The homeless man from the parking lot, the one who'd told me not to start my car. Marissa's breath caught, a thin, sharp gasp she couldn't disguise. My son shifted beside her, confusion tightening into something heavier. Concern, suspicion, the early shape of understanding. The attorney stood. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." The man didn't sit. He looked at me first, with a small nod that carried quiet reassurance. Then he looked at the attorney. "I just want to tell the truth," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it held a certainty that filled the room more than volume could. The attorney opened a new form. "Can you describe what you saw this morning?" He nodded. I was passing through the lot like I usually do. I saw a woman walking fast toward that car. He pointed gently toward the screen that still displayed the frozen frame of my vehicle. She kept looking around, thought she was being careful, but people who are scared always look over their shoulder too much. My son leaned closer, knuckles whitening around the edge of the table. What did she do? She bent down by the front end, the man said, put something under it, then walked off quick. Didn't even look back. The attorney motioned lightly. Do you see that person in this room now? A long pause followed. Not dramatic, just full of truth settling into place. The man lifted his hand slowly and pointed at Marissa. My son inhaled sharply. Marissa's voice cracked before she found words. This is ridiculous. He's mistaken. He doesn't know what he saw. But her voice faltered under its own weight. Too thin, too frantic, every syllable an unraveling thread. The attorney wrote something carefully, methodically. We'll verify the footage alongside this testimony. For now, this statement will be added to the file. My son turned to her fully. Why were you near my mother's car? His question wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was worse, steady, stunned, the kind of voice someone uses when reality starts breaking through the walls they didn't know were built around them. Marissa shook her head, eyes darting between him, the attorney, the witness. I didn't do anything. I was just... She couldn't finish. The man spoke again, quieter now. I came to warn her because your father was kind to me once, long time ago. I figured he'd want someone to look out for her. A warmth spread through my chest then. Not pride, not victory. Something deeper. Something like a memory settling into its rightful place. My son's face softened, confusion giving way to something heavier. A slow, painful realization that the narrative he'd been fed might not have been the truth at all. The attorney closed the testimony file. We'll proceed with the legal implications shortly. For now, the statement stands. The witness nodded to me again before stepping back toward the door. Marissa watched him leave, her expression hollowing by the second, fear carving itself into every corner of her silence. The truth wasn't approaching anymore. It was here. The door clicked shut behind the witness, and the room settled into a silence so complete it felt physical, like a weight pressing gently on every surface. My son stared ahead, his expression frozen, somewhere between disbelief and hurt, the pieces of his morning rearranging themselves in real time. Marissa kept her gaze fixed on the table, her shoulders rounded inward, her hands locked together as if she could hold the moment still long enough to escape it. The attorney didn't rush to fill the quiet. He gave it space, letting the reality of the testimony settle into the room before he opened the next document. The soft rustle of paper carried more impact than raised voices ever could. This section, he said calmly, contains your husband's personal notes, not legally binding on their own, but intended to guide how his estate is interpreted if conflicts arise. My breath steadied. I knew my husband's handwriting before the page even turned. Sharp strokes, deliberate spacing, the unmistakable script of a man who only wrote when something mattered. The attorney read, If ever my wife is placed in harm's way, by negligence, pressure, or intent, she is to be protected above all else. Her safety reflects my trust. Any act against her is an act against me. My son closed his eyes briefly, as if the words reached him in a place he had avoided looking into for far too long. Marissa's jaw tightened, her breath uneven. The attorney continued, flipping to the next page. Your husband also added this note. People reveal themselves in small ways. Watch what they do when they think no one is looking. A quiet truth, simple and devastating. My husband had understood the world through the actions it tried to bury. My son turned to Marissa. You said you never called the office. You said you never went near her car. His voice broke, not from anger, but from the tremor of something collapsing inside him. She didn't answer. Her silence had become its own confession. The attorney placed the pages down carefully. Given the testimony, the footage under review, and the documented attempt to influence the estate, the conditions outlined by your husband must now be enacted. Marissa's head snapped up. Enacted? Her voice wavered. You can't just... The attorney corrected her gently. I can, and I must. Any beneficiary involved in coercion, manipulation, or endangerment is immediately removed from consideration until a formal review is complete. My son exhaled a slow, painful breath. Not a word, not a protest, just the sound of realization settling in. I rested my palms on the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath them, grounding myself in the moment. I didn't need victory. I didn't need the room to acknowledge what had almost happened. All I needed was the truth to stand where lies had lived for too long. The attorney closed the folder. We will proceed to the primary allocation next. Marissa stared at the documents as if they were glowing, her world narrowing to the space she could no longer control. The morning had shifted again, quietly, firmly, and this time in my favor. The attorney opened the final folder with a kind of care that made the room lean into the moment. My son straightened, swallowing hard, as if bracing himself for whatever truth waited inside. Marissa didn't move. Her hands stayed locked together, white at the knuckles, her gaze fixed on a single spot on the polished table as if she could disappear into it. This, the attorney said, is the primary allocation of the estate. Your husband updated it shortly before his passing. My breath didn't catch. It didn't waver. It simply settled, steady and quiet, the way truth feels when it finally finds its way home. He continued, reading directly from the document. To my wife, I leave full authority over our home, accounts, and all shared assets. She stood beside me for more than 4 decades. She protected what we built. She deserves security and peace. My son's eyes softened, pain and understanding settling together in equal measure. He didn't protest. He didn't ask why. Deep down, he already knew. The attorney turned the page. To my son, I leave a conditional inheritance to be released only if he demonstrates respect and care toward his mother. Any sign of coercion or neglect nullifies his claim. A quiet exhale left him. He didn't argue. He didn't look at his wife. He stared down at his hands instead, absorbing the weight of his father's expectations he had forgotten somewhere along the way. Marissa's voice slipped out in a thin whisper. And me? The attorney didn't hesitate. You were not named as a beneficiary, and due to the conditions activated today, you are barred from any administrative role or access to marital assets. Her breath stuttered, catching in her throat. She tried to sit straighter, but the chair suddenly seemed too large for her, too sturdy for someone whose confidence had cracked in so many places. My son finally looked at her, really looked. You told me she didn't care about us. You told me she was trying to take everything. Marissa wiped at the corner of her eye, but no tears fell. I just wanted. But the rest never formed. The space where excuses usually lived was empty now, hollowed out by the morning's unraveling. The attorney slid the signed page toward me. Mrs. Carter, these are your documents. You may review or sign when ready. Everything listed here belongs to you. I placed my fingertips lightly on the edge of the folder. Not gripping, not claiming, just acknowledging. My husband had trusted me with his life, and now, even in death, he'd trusted me with his legacy. My son rose slowly from his chair, uncertainty and guilt twisting together on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Marissa remained seated, shoulders collapsing inward as though the air had thinned around her. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. I simply sat with the truth, calm, steady, unshaken, while the consequences settled gently, inevitably, around the people who had hoped I wouldn't survive the morning. The justice my husband intended had found its place. When the meeting finally ended, no one stood right away. The attorney gathered his papers with quiet precision, giving each of us a moment to absorb what had settled over the room. My son remained seated, shoulders heavy, his eyes lowered as though replaying every choice that had led us here. Marissa stared at the closed folder in front of her, the one that no longer held anything meant for her. Her breathing had steadied, but only because there was nothing left for her to grasp. I rose first, not out of triumph, not out of anger, simply because the moment had reached its end and someone had to acknowledge it. The chair legs made a soft sound against the floor, small but final. My son looked up, the weight of understanding clear in the way he met my eyes. There was regret in him, yes, but also something quieter, something like recognition. Maybe for the first time, he saw me not as the person others described, but as I truly was. Mom, he began, voice rough from the morning's unraveling. I offered him a gentle nod, not forgiveness, not yet, but a place where forgiveness could eventually live. I gathered the folder the attorney had handed me, the one bearing my husband's last decisions. The cover felt smooth beneath my fingers, familiar in a way I couldn't explain. He had always found ways to protect me, even when I hadn't realized I needed protecting. As I walked toward the door, the winter light from the hallway spilled across the conference room floor, a pale, steady glow that felt strangely like relief. Behind me, I heard my son exhale, a long breath that released something he'd been holding far too tightly. Marissa didn't speak again. She didn't look up. Her world had shifted, and she was still learning how to stand inside it. I stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind me. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of coffee from the lobby downstairs. For the first time since my husband passed, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I walked toward the elevator, each step light, certain, not because I had won anything, but because the truth had finally taken its rightful shape. The morning danger I had escaped, the lies uncovered piece by piece, the letter my husband left. All of it formed a complete circle now, closing gently around the woman I had become in the process. When the elevator doors opened, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. A woman older, yes, but steadier than she'd ever been. A woman who had survived loss, betrayal, and fear, and still stood upright. I pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors slid shut, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been clenched since the day I buried my husband. Not joy, not victory, just the quiet certainty that I was still here, still standing, and still mine.